What is eugenics? By definition, eugenics is the science of improving a human population controlled by breeding to increase the occurrence of desirable characteristics and heritable traits. It was largely developed by a man named Francis Galton as a method to help improve the human race, but quickly fell out of favor when the only people who tried to implement this practice were the Nazis. Today we see eugenics in specialized breeding of animals such as dogs, cats, and in prized livestock such as horses and cattle. Beginning in the early 20th century, many scientists were skeptical of the findings of eugenics. Eugenicists argued that parents that had good genes, or in that time what was called good stock, would produce healthier and more intellectually superior children. These scientists believed that traits like poverty, shiftlessness, criminality, and poor work ethic were all inherited traits and could be passed down to their children. Although there was little scientific evidence of this, however, the eugenicists were able to persuade the Carnegie Institution and many prestigious universities to support their work, eventually legitimizing it and creating the perception that their thought-up philosophy was actually science. It was then that the movement became seen as a way to help improve society and was supported by famous people like Winston Churchill, Margaret Sanger, Theodore Roosevelt, and John Harvey Kellogg. The science became an academic study at many prestigious colleges such as Harvard, to name one of them. But from science can only cause criticism. People like Clarence Darrow stated that purity in genetics can only lead to fewer negative gene mutations. They think this led to more than 80,000 compulsory sterilizations. Experts on this matter actually think there were more sterilizations than just those, but they were failed to be recorded. In the 1920s, we saw the Nazi regime take off. Adolf Hitler based his early ideas of eugenics off programs that were actually practiced in the United States. Hitler was one of the most famous practitioners of eugenics. The Nazis ended up killing tens of thousands of people and sterilized hundreds of thousands that were deemed inferior and medically unfit. After World War II and the Holocaust, the American eugenics movement was condemned, but sterilization programs continued into the mid-1970s. While the Hitler regime liked the concept of a blonde hair and blue-eyed race, the idea itself did not originate with Hitler. The idea was actually created in the United States and cultivated in California. This happened decades before Hitler even took power. The California eugenicists played a large part in the American eugenics movement campaign for what they called ethnic cleansing. The Carnegie Institution, Rockefeller Foundation, and the Harmon Railroad Fortune all gave eugenics extensive funding for their research. They were all in league with some of America's most respected and well-known scientists coming from universities like Stanford, Harvard, Yale, and even Princeton. Scientists adopted race theory and race science and used their data to serve the eugenics' racist aims. At this time, the president of Stanford University wrote a book titled Blood of a Nation. In this book, he captioned the phrase race and blood, declaring the human qualities and conditions of things like talent and poverty were something that could actually be passed through blood inheritance. This later brought on the superior species movement, where the eugenicists craved blonde-haired, blue-eyed Nordic type. They believed that this group alone was the only group fit to inherit the earth. But in this process, the movement intended to extract Black, Indian, Asian, and Hispanics. Anyone classified not fit genetic lines were to be drawn up by American raceologists. Skipping forward to the 40s, thousands of Germans were taken from their old age homes in places like mental institutions and other custodial facilities and were systematically gassed, killing between 50 and 100,000. It was then in 1943 when eugenicist medical assistant Joseph Mengele arrived in Auschwitz and began searching for twins to experiment on. During this time, the Rockefellers that helped to fund the research never knew how gruesome the experiments that Mengele conducted were. With a few exceptions, the Foundation had ceased all of their eugenics studies that took place in the Nazi-occupied Europe before the war had started in 1939. After World War II, the eugenics movement was declared a crime against humanity and an act of genocide. The Germans were tried and cited the California statutes to try and aid in their defense, but were found guilty. Human genetics and genocidal roots that came along with eugenics were often ignored by a victorious generation that had refused to link itself with the crimes of the Nazis. By the late 20th century, human genetics had become an enlightened endeavor. Through the Human Genome Project, every individual can now be biologically identified and classified by trait and ancestry. You can thank them for Ancestry.com and 23andMe kits. These kits will now help you link your genetic history and find out where your ancestors came from. Genetics is still being learned all over the world, and there are still some who want a master race. On October 14, 2003, America passed the first genetic anti-discrimination legislation with a unanimous Senate vote. Yet, because genetics research is still global, there is no single nation that can stop the threats of genetic research abuse.